Alright, welcome back to part 6. This is where we're going to talk about the morale phase, which is actually really quick and easy to learn, but we're also going to talk about some odds and ends as well, some other things in the core rules that we want to touch on that will just kind of fit into a miscellaneous section here. But this should be essentially the last video for you to learn the core rules. So after part 6 here, you'll essentially know the basics to Warhammer 40k and how to start playing. I'll probably do some other videos to talk about different ways to play and how to set up the board and all that fun stuff. But as far as core rules go, these 6 videos cover it. Okay, so the morale phase. So this is the last phase of a player's turn. So we've said there's the movement phase, there's the psychic phase, the shooting phase, the charge phase, and then the assault phase. And that's what you saw in video 5. Now we move on to the morale phase. This is the thing you do to wrap up a player's turn. The morale phase essentially just represents models fleeing from the battlefield because they were ravaged during the turn and they lost too many of their units. So they're fleeing and they're going away. So what this means is that you can actually lose more models in this phase. Your opponent player can also lose models as well. But let's take a look at how this actually works. So you actually start with the players whose turn it actually is. So in my examples, I've been saying it's the Space Marines here, their turn. So since they're wrapping up their turn, they're the ones that will first make their morale checks. Now, you make morale checks for any unit that lost any models during that turn. So if we had an assault going on here, and let's say that this unit had maybe 5 Space Marines in it, but lost 3 of them, and here are the 2 remaining Space Marines, they will have to make a morale check. Let's say this unit here was trying to actually assault into this unit over here, but during that charge declaration, they were overwatched and lost 2 of their models, and then they failed their charge, so they never got into assault, but they were shot at and lost 2 of their models. Because they lost 2 of their models, they will also have to make a morale check. And let's also just say that this unit here, when it did its assault, it assaulted this unit of Space Marines here, and this unit of Space Marines, maybe they lost 2 of their models, so they only have 1 model left in their unit. So it will also have to make a morale check. So how do you make a morale check? Well, again, because it's the Space Marine player's turn, he's going to make his morale checks first. So what you're going to do is you're going to look for what's called a leadership value. You're going to take the highest leadership value of the model in your unit. So in this case here, let's say that we have these 5 models here. They're all the same except that we have one. Again, we've been saying that these are intercessors, so let's pretend that this guy over here with the sword is actually an intercessor sergeant. So his leadership actually might be higher than the others, and because it's higher than the others, you'll use his leadership to make this morale check. So let's take a look at their profile here. So if we look at the intercessor squad, you're going to see on the data sheet here all the way over to the end something called LD, that's the leadership, and your basic intercessor has a leadership of 7, but the sergeant has a leadership value of 8, so it's a little bit better. And because we have a sergeant over here, we're going to use his leadership characteristic. So he has a leadership of 8. So we'll start with making a morale check with these guys right here. What they're going to want to do is they're going to roll 2 dice, and they're going to want to roll under a 7. So in this case, if we rolled a 3, they would have passed their morale check because it would have been less than or equal to 8, because the intercessor sergeant has a leadership of 8, so they would have passed it because it's less than or equal to 8. But let's pretend that instead they actually rolled a 10. So in this case, they rolled greater than the leadership value of the intercessor sergeant there. If you roll higher than your leadership value, what you actually do is you lose a model by every point you rolled over the highest leadership value. So in this case, we rolled a 10 and the highest leadership value was 8. So we rolled over by 2. So in that case, I would have to select 2 of my models to remove from play. Even if they have more than 1 wound, they still lose 1 model for each point you rolled over by. So even if these guys were 2 wound models, which would equal 4 wounds total, you'd still have to remove 2 because you rolled over by 2. And of course I get to select which ones go away, but this represents them fleeing the battlefield because they failed their morale check. I would then go to the next unit over here, and if these were intercessors, but they didn't have a sergeant, their leadership would be 7. So in this case, if I rolled a 10 for them, Again, failing it by 3 this time, I would have to remove both models from play and that unit would be dead. The same would go for then the enemy models or my opponent's models. He would have to select his units that lost models during my turn and then make a morale check for those units. So in this case, we said that this unit lost, I think it was 2 models, so he'd have to roll for them and then check to see if he failed or passed his morale check. Once you've removed whatever models you need to from failed morale checks, the turn is now over. And that is essentially all 6 phases of a player's turn. We would then pass the play over to the opponent, and the opponent would then get to do the same 6 phases. And this would go on for however many turns the game lasted. Okay, and just some miscellaneous things that we want to throw in on this video include talking about transports. So some vehicles will be labeled as a transport in their data sheet. This is a Rhino, one of the Space Marines transports, and I just want to talk a little bit about how you embark and disembark from a transport vehicle. So first off, if we take a look at the Rhino's data sheet, so if we go to the Space Marine Codex here, you'll see that it actually says that it is a transport vehicle, and under transport vehicle you'll see it tells you what it can transport, in this case 10 chapter infantry models, so we can put essentially 10 Space Marines in there. It also explicitly says what cannot go into the Rhino. So this is the rules you're going to follow for what a transport can actually carry. Since we're looking at the data sheet here, I should also just point out, since we just in the last video talked about assaulting and charging, vehicles can actually assault and charge now, and so if you look, they actually have a weapon skill as well as a number of attacks, and so they can actually hit you in close combat. I suppose this is to represent them running into you. So here we have our transport, and we have 7 Space Marines. Now at the beginning of the game, you can actually start these Space Marines in the Rhino, so when you set them up on the board, you would just keep these guys off the table and indicate that this unit was in this Rhino, and then you would set the Rhino up on the board. However, you can also put units into a transport during a game, as well as take them out at a certain point whenever you're ready. So let's look at those rules. So first off, let's look at embarking. So if a unit wants to embark on a transport, all they have to do is end their move within 3 inches of the transport. So in this case, if these Space Marines ended their movement within 3 inches of this transport, you would then take these models off the board and they would be represented as being inside the Rhino. Now, once models go into a transport unit, their abilities no longer count. What I mean by that is some models might have things like auras where they affect a certain number of units within so many inches around them. Well, that no longer works when they are inside a transport. So you don't measure out from a transport to give other units any kind of bonus effect, unless it explicitly says it in their profile that whatever ability they have is usable inside of a transport. In this case, these Space Marines would not have any kind of effects that could be used inside a transport. Once they're in the transport, you're using the transport's profile, and that's it. Okay, so then let's look at the reverse. Let's look at disembarking. So let's pretend that this unit is actually embarked on this Rhino. In the movement phase, before this transport moves, it can disembark this unit. You disembark the same way as you embark, meaning that these models go outside the transport within 3 inches of the transport, so that as long as they leave the transport within 3 inches, they're good. After that point, the transport can do its movement, and these guys can actually do their movement, shoot and charge, assault, everything they would normally do in their turn. Alright, so let's talk about another important rule that you need to know about, and that is modifiers and rerolls. There are some abilities that might allow you to reroll certain things, like to hit rolls or to wound rolls in shooting or charging and assault, but they kind of work in an interesting way. So typically when you see an ability that allows a reroll, it might say, you know, let's pretend that this HQ character here gives any of his units within 6 inches a reroll of to hit rolls, failed to hit rolls. So if these guys are trying to shoot these chaos enemies over here, and they typically need let's say a 3+, their ballistic skill is 3, they need a 3+ to shoot these guys. If they fail that, meaning if they roll a 2 or 1, this guy's ability would allow them to re-roll those shots and hit them. Now, rerolls kind of work in a very specific way in this game. They happen before modifiers are applied. Well, what does that mean? Well, let's say that these Chaos Space Marines also have an ability that says whenever a unit shoots at them, they subtract 1 from the shooting target's ballistic skill. So let's say that their modifier here, which would be -1 to ballistic skill, affects these Space Marines. So we just said normally these guys would need a 3+ to hit them, and in this case, because of their modifier, they would actually need a 4+, because in this case, I guess it would be sort of like a +1 to their ballistic skill. So it makes it harder for these guys to hit them. They would actually need a 4+. Now, because these guys have a reroll because of his ability, allowing them to reroll their hit rolls, the rerolls happen before this modifier is actually applied. What does that mean? Let's do an example here. So let's pretend that these two Space Marines are shooting at these 3 Space Marines here. Now, like I said, they need a 3+ to hit them. So let's say they each get 2 attacks and they roll. Let's say they got a 1, a 2, a 3, and a 6. That's what they roll. Now, they get to roll their misses. And as we said before, these guys are applying a modifier to them. Whenever they're shot at, they're going to add 1 to the ballistic skill of the shooting unit. So in this case, these guys, which means that their ballistic skill becomes a 4. So they would technically need a 4+ to hit them. So looking at these die, we have a 1, 2, 3, and a 6. So technically, as it stands right now, the 6 is the only one that actually is going to hit them. So these other 3 are technically failed hit rolls. But because modifiers are applied after the reroll, this 3 is currently a hit. Because if the modifier was not there, these guys' ballistic skill is a 3+, meaning that this 3 would technically go through and hit. So even though we know that in the end, it's going to actually need to be a 4+ to get through and hit them, as of right now, it stands as a hit. So this one does hit. This one technically would hit, but it's going to fail because in the end we're going to need a 4+. But what this means is we can't re-roll this right now. Their re-roll ability is failed hit rolls right now, and technically this is currently a hit. So then all we get to do is re-roll these 2. In this case, we roll a 6, which is going to be a hit, and a 2, which is still a fail. So now, this modifier from this unit is applied. In this case, we look at the dice and the modifier is now applied. So the modifier says that these guys actually need a 4+ to hit them. So this 3, which was a hit, is now a miss. So in the end, these guys only successfully hit them twice. So that's sort of the tricky thing about the rerolls here. Rerolls are typically pretty straightforward, but you have to remember that modifiers are applied after you reroll. So when you're doing quick rolling, keep in mind that, you know, don't make a mental note that you're trying to add the modifier immediately in your head, because technically you're rolling for whatever they actually need to hit, and then the modifier is applied in the very end. So some of those hits are going to become misses. So just try to remember that. That's actually one you're probably going to forget. I know I'm going to forget it. That's why I'm harping on it right now. And since we're talking about modifiers, I might as well just also add that you can't modify a unit's characteristic for strength, leadership, or toughness below 1. So you can't give them a leadership, toughness, or strength of 0. They have to go down to a minimum of 1. Alright, well, thanks for joining for part 6 here, where we talked a bit about morale checks as well as some miscellaneous things that we didn't touch on in the other videos. This actually wraps everything up and gives you the core, essentially the core rules to how to play Warhammer 40k. There are 3 ways to play, with narrative, match play, and open play. And probably what we'll do next is we'll get in our first game of Warhammer 40k 8th edition, and it'll be a little bit more detailed than one of my typical battle reports, because I'll probably walk us through the stages of actually setting up the board, picking the mission, and going on from there. So stay tuned, we'll play our first game of Warhammer 40k 8th edition. Thanks for watching. If you liked it, please hit the like button, and if you want to see more Wolfpack Wargaming, hit the subscribe.